The land smelled of iron before the rain came. That particular heaviness in the air, the kind that pressed down on the backs of cattle and made horses pin their ears flat, had been sitting over the valley since morning, but the sky remained white and stubborn and dry. The creek along the south pasture had fallen to a thread of muddy water no wider than a man's outstretched hand, and the cottonwoods along its edge had gone still in a way that felt less like calm and more like the pause before something is said. Grasshoppers worked through the low brush in waves, their sound a kind of grinding static that filled the spaces between wind gusts. The red dirt of the trail had cracked into irregular patterns, each piece curling slightly at the edges, lifting from the ground as though trying to get free of something underneath. Harlan Voss had been working the south fence line since noon. He was not a talkative man, and he had learned to appreciate that about himself over the years. When the work was there, the work got done. When there was nothing to say, nothing got said. The section of fence he was mending wasn't in urgent disrepair. 3 posts had settled slightly, and a stretch of wire had gone slack enough that a determined animal might push through. But in this kind of heat, with the kind of restlessness that came with low air pressure and no wind, work was the only thing that put time in its proper order. He had been at it 2 hours and cut his left palm twice on the barbed wire. Both times he had looked at the cuts briefly, pressed them against his thigh, and kept pulling. He was working the 3rd post from the end when he heard the horse. The difference between a horse moving at a normal pace and one being driven hard is in the rhythm. The way the hoofbeats overlap differently, the way there is no pause in the stride, no economy of effort. Harlan had grown up around horses, and the sound reached him the way most sounds come to people who have been paying attention long enough. Not as information to decode, but as something already understood before the thinking part begins. He straightened up from the post and turned south, where the ridgeline broke the sky into a ragged edge, and he waited. The animal came over the crest at a full gallop. A dark bay mare, well-muscled and long-legged, with white foam already working around the bit and her neck extended low and flat. On her back, a rider with no saddle, just a folded blanket and the grip of bare legs against the horse's sides. A girl, young, with black hair that had come loose and was pressed flat against the rush of air. She spotted him before she reached the bottom of the slope, and instead of turning or slowing, she aimed directly at him. Harlan didn't move. He had made the mistake once of backing away from something coming fast, and he had learned that backing away changes a situation more often than holding still does. He stood beside the fence post, hammer still in his right hand, and let the distance close. When she pulled the mare up hard 10 yards from him, the horse reared once, a short, tight movement, and then landed and stamped and blew hard through her nostrils, sides heaving. The girl looked at him. Her eyes were dry, but they had the specific redness of eyes that had been crying not long ago and had stopped with great deliberateness. There was a tightness in her jaw, a stillness in the rest of her face, that he had seen before in people who had come out the far side of panic and arrived somewhere quieter and more resolved. She was 15, maybe 16. Hard to say with certainty. The things her face had been through in the last day or two had compressed the usual markers of age into something harder and more compact. She slid off the mare in one smooth motion and held the reins out toward him. "Take her," she said. "She is worth much. She's the best horse my father has ever kept. Take her and come with me." Harlan looked at the mare. The horse was indeed a fine animal, the kind that tells you something about the person who cared for her, because there is no way to maintain that quality in a working horse without consistent and knowledgeable attention. He looked back at the girl. "What happened to your father?" "He was shot." She said it plainly, with no melodrama, the way a person says a thing they have had time to accept as fact. 2 days ago, he came back to camp wounded. The bullet is still inside. He is alive, But the fever started last night and I do not know how to take it out." She paused. "There is no one else who can help. I rode south because there was nothing else to do." Harlan studied her face a moment longer. He was not the kind of man who moved quickly on instinct alone, but he was also not the kind who confused caution with paralysis. The calculus was simple. A man was dying. A girl had ridden through open country alone to find someone who might help. Whatever complications existed around that, the who and the why and the what people might say, those were secondary to the thing directly in front of him. "How far is the camp?" he asked. 3 hours north, maybe a little more." "Into the breaks?" "Yes." He set down his hammer against the fence post. "Come," he said, and he took the mare's reins, not as payment, not as any decision about payment, but because the horse needed to be walked and cooled before another hour on the trail. He started toward the barn. The girl fell into step beside him without a word. If this story has you this far, subscribing to the channel costs you nothing, and it's what keeps these histories coming every week. Cormac Deal was forking old hay out of the corner stall when they came through the side door, and he stopped what he was doing and looked at the girl the way he looked at most things, taking in everything at once without making it obvious. And then he looked at Harlan. "Father's shot," Harlan said. "Camp's 3 hours north. I'm going." Cormac was a lean man from the western counties of Ireland by way of a decade in Texas, and he had opinions about most situations, but had developed the wisdom to hold them behind his teeth until they were wanted. He leaned the pitchfork against the stall wall. "I'll saddle the grey then," he said. "You don't have to come." "No," Cormac agreed evenly. "But here I am anyway." The girl's name was Nietzsche. She said it during the first half hour of riding, when Cormac asked her directly and politely, and she gave it the same way she said most things, efficiently, without ornamentation, with the sense of someone who had determined that anything not useful to the current situation could wait. She rode at the front because she knew the terrain, and she moved through the broken country north of the valley, with the particular ease of someone who has spent time learning a landscape the way you learn a language, not by translating each word, but by beginning eventually to think in it. She told them what she knew about the wound while they rode. The bullet had entered from the right side, below the ribs. Her father had made it back to camp on horseback. She still didn't entirely understand how, but by the time he dismounted, he couldn't stand straight. The wound had bled significantly the first day, but had slowed. The coughing had started the second morning, and there had been blood in it. She had packed the site with what she had, kept him warm, given him water, and waited for others of the band to come through. No one had come. "So you decided yourself," Cormac said. "Yes." "How long did it take you?" "Deciding." Nietzsche glanced back at him with an expression that was not quite impatient, but close to it. "I decided when I saw there was no other choice. The deciding didn't take long." Cormac nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he'd suspected. The terrain changed as they moved north, the valley grasses giving way to rocky slopes, the ground becoming more unpredictable, the trail narrowing in places to a single horse width between outcroppings of dark red rock that absorbed the heat and gave it back steadily through the afternoon. Nietzsche navigated without hesitation. At one point she raised her hand and they stopped, and she listened to something Harlan couldn't hear, and then she moved on. He didn't ask what she'd heard. He had been in enough unfamiliar country, with enough people who knew it better than he did, to understand that some knowledge doesn't survive the translation into words. They reached the camp in the late afternoon. It was tucked into a shallow bowl between two rock formations that rose 15 feet on either side, channeling the air through in a way that kept it somewhat cooler than the surrounding terrain. It was a good position, defensible, sheltered, invisible from any approach until you were already inside the bowl. 3 other people were there. An old woman who acknowledged their arrival with a brief glance and no expression. A boy of perhaps 8 or 9 who stared at Harlan and Cormac with open and entirely uncomplicated curiosity, and the man lying under a low shelter of branches and stretched hide on the east side of the bowl. His name was Taza. Nietzsche said it quietly as they crossed toward him, not as a formal introduction, but as a way of returning his name to him in a moment when he looked like he needed it. He was a large, framed man, broad across the shoulders, long-limbed, and in health he would have been a formidable presence. Right now he was the color of old ash. His breathing had the quality of something labored, each inhale requiring visible effort, and there was a sound deep in his chest that Harlan recognized and did not like. The fever showed in the sweat that had soaked through his shirt, and in the way his eyes, when they opened and found Harlan's face, moved with a slight delay, as though the signal had to travel further than usual. "Nietzsche," the man said. His voice was rough but coherent. She knelt beside him and spoke close to his face, in Apache, something low and direct. He listened. His eyes moved to Harlan again and this time stayed there. He looked at Harlan for a long moment with the kind of deliberate, assessing gaze that is only possible from someone who has chosen to be fully present despite the body's attempts to pull them elsewhere. Then he looked away, toward the pale sky above the rim of the rock formation. Harlan took that as permission and went to work. The wound was worse than he had hoped and not quite as bad as he had feared. The entry site was infected, expected after 2 days, with a ring of inflammation around it that suggested the bullet was causing continuous irritation from movement or position. He cleaned the area carefully with carbolic acid. Taza made no sound during this, not a flinch, not a change in breathing. Harlan noted it and did not remark on it, but he noted it. The extraction was the part that mattered most. He had used the forceps 3 times before this, twice on calves in difficult births, once on himself removing a fragment of metal from his own forearm after a wagon accident, which he had no interest in discussing or repeating. He worked slowly and by feel as much as by sight, applying careful, graduated pressure, adjusting for the angle, feeling for the resistance. After 4 minutes, the bullet came free with a scraping drag that he felt in his back teeth. He held it up briefly in the last light, misshapen, flattened on one side from impact against bone. That was the rib then, which explained the angle and the coughing both. He set it aside. The rest was cleaning and packing and wrapping, and a careful measure of laudanum dissolved in water that Nietzsche held for her father, while Harlan supported his shoulders. Taza swallowed without complaint and closed his eyes, and his breathing over the next 20 minutes gradually settled into something that sounded closer to actual sleep. By the time the evening had shifted the light to that specific red-orange that belongs to the high desert in the final half hour before dark, Taza was genuinely sleeping. Nietzsche sat at his side without moving. The old woman had begun preparing food and set a portion near Harlan without speaking, which he understood as an offer and accepted with a nod. Cormac had fallen asleep against a rock with his hat over his face, which Harlan thought showed a commendable ability to be useful and then immediately stopped being present. The boy came and sat near Harlan while the camp settled into its evening rhythms. He spoke some English. Enough, Harlan gathered, for the kind of conversation an 8-year-old prefers. Specific, concrete, not particularly concerned with social conventions. "Does it hurt?" the boy asked, pointing at the cuts on Harlan's palm. "Some," Harlan said. "My father's hurts more." "Yes, but he's sleeping now." "When you sleep, does it hurt less?" Harlan thought about this. "Usually," he said. The boy nodded slowly, accepting this as accurate medical information, and sat quietly for a time. Then, "Will you sleep here?" "I think so. It's getting dark." The boy seemed to find this a reasonable decision and said nothing more. That night, Harlan lay on his back and looked at the stars through the gap between the rock formations, listening to the camp breathe. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called 3 times, and then went silent. Taza's breathing had steadied further. Nietzsche was a shape in the near dark, positioned between the shelter and where Harlan and Cormac had settled, not aggressively, but with intention. He understood it. He would have done the same. He woke before dawn to a sound he couldn't immediately identify and lay still for a moment, and then he understood what it was. The absence of a sound. Taza's labored breathing had stopped. He rose quickly and then stopped because Nietzsche was already there at her father's side, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead, and leaving it there. He understood what that meant before he crossed to them. The fever had broken. Not gradually, not partially. It had broken through the night and left Taza's skin damp rather than burning. His color shifted from ash toward something closer to his own, his breathing full and even and no longer carrying that sound beneath it. Nietzsche held her hand against her father's forehead for a long moment. Harlan watched the tension leave her shoulders as though something had been cut loose. He went back and sat by the dead fire and waited for the light. By mid-morning, Taza was conscious and able to drink and take a small amount of food. He was weak in the profound way that comes after a body has used everything it had, the kind of weakness that needs weeks to fully leave. But the wound was not worsening. The fever was gone. He was going to live. Harlan changed the dressing one more time, gave Nietzsche clear instructions about cleaning and signs to watch for, and then there was nothing else to do. He believed then, as they made ready to leave, that the hard part was behind them. The ride south was easier than the ride north. The terrain was familiar, and the morning was cooler, and the horses moved at a comfortable pace. Nietzsche accompanied them for the first hour. She said it was to see them through the narrow section of the trail, which was true, and also the other thing, which was that she wasn't entirely ready to let them go. Harlan didn't mention either reason. 2 miles south of where the breaks opened into open valley, Cormac spotted the riders coming from the east. 4 of them, from the direction of Caldera Creek settlement, moving at a trot that became a canter when the distance narrowed enough for recognition to flow both ways. Harlan knew Burton Hale's pale grey gelding before he could make out the man's face. 1 black stocking on the left foreleg, a distinctive white patch on the haunch, a way of carrying the head high and slightly to the right that was unmistakable at any distance. Hale was the largest landholder in the valley, a man who had been in the territory long enough to have developed the particular kind of authority that comes not from any official position, but simply from the fact of being large and established and accustomed to having opinions that became outcomes. The 4 men pulled up in a loose line. Birch, Hale's foreman, on a roan sorrel. 2 others Harlan didn't know. Voss, Hale said. It was the kind of greeting that wasn't one. Burton. Hale's eyes moved from Harlan to Cormac to Nietzsche on the bay mare, and they stayed there the way eyes stay on something that hasn't been resolved yet. Word came down from the settlement, Hale said. Apache girl riding alone, heading south. People got concerned. People concern themselves with a lot of things, Harlan said. Her people have a camp up in the breaks. They do. You've been up there. I have. Hale was quiet for a moment. He was not a stupid man. Harlan had always acknowledged that, even when he found himself opposed to him. And he was working through something now, running calculations that had more variables than he'd expected. You went to help them, he said. Her father was shot. I went to pull the bullet and clean the wound. He'll live. Who shot him? I didn't ask. He didn't say. Birch shifted in his saddle. He was a heavy man with the kind of stillness that isn't calm, but is simply the stillness of someone waiting for permission. This is a concern, Hale said. He said it carefully, choosing the word deliberately. Not a threat, a concern. An Apache camp that close to grazing land. People are looking at what it means. Harlan looked at him steadily. What it means is that a family was camped up in the breaks because the breaks are good shelter. What it means is that a man got shot and nearly died, and his daughter rode 12 miles alone to find help. I helped because the alternative was watching someone die who didn't have to. He paused a moment. I'm not sure what any of that has to do with your grazing land, Burton. Hale's jaw tightened, then released. He looked at Nietzsche directly, a deliberate shift, a choice, and said, Your father going to be all right? Nietzsche met his eyes and held them without adjustment. Yes, she said. One word, flat and certain as a stone. Hale nodded once. He started to turn his horse and stopped. Voss, he said without looking back. Next time someone asks you about this, I'd appreciate it if you didn't go out of your way to make me sound like the problem. Harlan thought about it. Tell your men to act right, he said, and I'll have no reason to. Hale rode east with his men and didn't look back. Cormac let out a long, slow breath. Well, he said. That went better than it had any right to. Nietzsche said nothing. She looked at the departing riders for a moment, then turned the mare north. Thank you, she said over her shoulder, without stopping, and she was gone before Harlan could decide whether anything needed saying in return. He and Cormac rode the last stretch in silence. The ranch looked exactly as he'd left it. The same posts, the same light on the barn roof, the same unfixed section of south fence where the hammer was still propped against the post. He unsaddled, brushed down his horse, checked the water trough. Cormac did the same, and they didn't speak much while they did it, and that was fine. He told no one what had happened. Not because it was a secret, but because it didn't feel like something that needed broadcasting. Things had happened, and they were done, and the next morning there would be other things. He finished the fence that evening working by the last of the light, and came in and ate and cleaned the cuts on his palm properly for the first time and wrapped them in clean cloth. He sat on the porch for a while after dark, looking at the shape of the land under the stars. He was wrong to think it was settled. 3 days after he returned, Burton Hale came to the ranch alone. No men with him, which Harlan noted. He came on the grey gelding and dismounted at the gate and tied the horse himself, and he came to the porch and waited there rather than calling out. Harlan came out when he heard the hooves and found Hale standing with his hat in his hands in a way that looked unfamiliar on him, like a garment he'd borrowed from someone else's life. I want to talk to you, Hale said. All right. About the camp, the Apache in the breaks. Harlan waited. Hale looked out at the pasture for a moment, gathering something. I talked to the men I had with me on the trail, not Birch. Birch is his own situation, but the others. When I told them what you said, what you'd done, they didn't react the way I was expecting. How did they react? They got quiet, Hale said. The kind of quiet that means they're thinking. Harlan didn't respond to that. I've been in this territory longer than most, Hale said. I've seen a lot of things go wrong. Not wrong in the way people intend, wrong in the way things go when people make up their minds too fast about who belongs near them and who doesn't. He turned the hat in his hands. I'm not saying I was right to ride out there. I'm not saying I was wrong. I'm saying I want to understand what you're thinking about what happens next. What do you mean, what happens next? Word gets around, Hale said. It always does. People are going to know you went up there, spent the night. Came back like it was nothing. It was what it was, Harlan said. That's not nothing. It's not something to make a story out of either. Hale looked at him with something that might have been frustration, and might have been something more honest beneath it. What would you have done? Harlan asked. If it had been a white girl, same situation. Father shot, camp up in the breaks, girl rides 12 miles alone to find help. Hale was quiet. "You'd have gone," Harlan said. He said it without judgment, simply as a fact. "You'd have gone, and nobody would have ridden out afterward to ask about your grazing land." Hale stood with that for a moment. He put his hat back on. He stood there another moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then he said, "I'll talk to Birch. He's got a mouth that runs ahead of his sense. I'd appreciate that." Hale nodded once and went back to his horse and rode south without looking back. The moment that people around Caldera Creek still mentioned in the years after, though the details shifted with each telling, the way details always do, happened 12 days after Harlan had gone north into the breaks. A Tuesday, which seemed like an unremarkable day for the thing that occurred on it. Taza came to the ranch. He came with Nietzsche and the boy and the old woman, all four of them riding, Taza upright in the saddle, with the careful, deliberate posture of a man who knows exactly how much movement his body will allow and has calibrated accordingly. He had recovered enough color to look like himself, though he still held his right side with some awareness of it. They rode through the gate, and Harlan came out of the barn to meet them, and for a moment the five of them were in the yard together in the bright, flat light of midday. Harlan extended his hand. Taza looked at it for a moment. Then he took it and shook it once firmly, looking Harlan in the face while he did. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said, or nothing that talking would do better than that grip had already done. 6 men from the Caldera Creek settlement had come to water their horses at the South Trough that morning. A common arrangement in dry periods, nothing unusual about it. They were still there, 3 of them visible in the yard near the hitching post, and 3 more at the trough behind the barn when Taza and his family rode in. All 6 saw it. The handshake, the plainness of it. The fact that Harlan did not look around first to check who was watching before he put his hand out. The quiet that happened in those men was a specific kind of quiet. Not discomfort, not agreement, closer to the sensation of picking something up and finding it heavier or lighter than you expected, so that your whole body has to adjust to the new information. One of them, a young man named Seward, who had come to the territory the previous spring from Missouri and still carried the provisional opinions of someone recently arrived, said later that he didn't entirely understand what had shifted, only that something had. Nietzsche had brought something wrapped in deer hide, which she set on the porch railing without comment. The boy spoke to Harlan in a confident mix of Apache and fragmented English, reinforced with gesture. And Harlan nodded seriously throughout, as though receiving important news, which made the boy appear satisfied with the exchange. The old woman looked at the water in the trough by the barn, then looked at Harlan and said something brief. Nietzsche translated. She said the water was clean. Harlan said he had been working to keep it that way. The old woman seemed to find this a satisfactory report and said nothing else. They rode north before the afternoon was old. Harlan watched them go until the trail bent east behind the far pasture wall, and they disappeared. He turned back to find 2 of the Caldera Creek men still in the yard, not quite ready to leave, but uncertain what they were staying for. He said nothing to them. He went to the porch and unwrapped the deer hide. Inside was a small carved figure, a horse, shaped from bone or possibly antler, no longer than his thumb, smooth and precise in a way that required real time and care. The legs were accurate. The angle of the head suggested movement without overstating it. He turned it in his palm for a while in the afternoon light, feeling the weight of it, which was less than he expected but felt like more. One of the Caldera Creek men walked past him toward the gate and, as he passed, glanced at the carving. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away quickly either. He looked at it the way you look at something that doesn't fit neatly into the available categories. and finding the available categories insufficient, you simply keep looking. Harlan put the carving in his shirt pocket and went to check the fence. He kept it there for years. Through every season the territory offered, through summer heat and the particular mud of spring that seemed to take everything and give nothing back, through the succession of things that happened and didn't happen, through faces that came and went. The smooth edge of the carving became familiar to his fingers in the way anything carried long enough becomes familiar, without announcement, without ceremony, simply as part of the texture of an ordinary life. He never displayed it. He never explained it to anyone who noticed the small shape in his pocket. If someone asked, he said it was a carving. That was all. Some things don't need more explanation than what they already are. Conta nos comentários o que você teria feito no lugar do Harlan. E o que você acha que o Taza disse para os filhos sobre aquele dia.